The record begins with silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers no hand claims. 9 coffins, each sealed too soon, tell their story not with words but with scratches. And in Charleston, whispers of one man's vengeance drifted like smoke through the corridors of power. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1853, though the roots of what transpired reached further back, tangled in the soil of Charleston's slave markets and the quiet violence of households that dressed brutality in civility. The name most often spoken in the public records is Solomon Fairfax, a man once considered an exemplary servant, trained in medicine under Dr. Hathaway, and long entrusted with knowledge and responsibility that few in bondage were ever permitted to touch. But what his journals later revealed, and what the courts reluctantly confirmed, is that Solomon harbored a grief so consuming it bent his medical learning into a weapon, one whose shadow would outlive even the wealthiest of Charleston's men. In that decade, Charleston stood as both jewel and wound, an economic stronghold built upon the slave trade, while also a city desperate to maintain its image of refinement. The auctions were held with the same cadence as social gatherings, merchants and planters moving with practiced detachment among families torn apart at the block. Even within households there existed a code of silence, a refusal to speak of the suffering upon which polite life was constructed, and it was within this silence that Solomon endured the destruction of his own family. His wife and children were sold southward, torn from him in what his master described simply as an economic necessity. From this moment, the records suggest something inside him altered irreversibly. What makes Solomon's story so unsettling, even now, is not merely the violence of his retribution, but the meticulous manner in which he enacted it. His journal, discovered decades later and suppressed soon after, lays bare the paradox of a man trained to heal but resolved to harm. The handwriting is careful, the sentences stripped of ornament, resembling less the confession of a criminal than the calculations of a scholar. He writes not of rage but of balance, of ensuring that the terror his children endured would be felt in equal measure by those who authored it. The trial records, what little remain uncensored, hint at a city unprepared for such revelations. The testimony of 6 men who survived Solomon's paralytic compound transformed public fascination into horror. These men, pronounced dead, were carried through the rituals of mourning. While trapped within unresponsive bodies, they could hear the sobs of their wives, smell the candles burning beside them, and feel the cold touch of hands arranging their limbs for burial, all while screaming in silence beneath skin that betrayed no motion. Solomon's design, they realized too late, was not only death but the rehearsal of death itself, a descent into the grave endured while the world carried on above. But part 1 of this account is not concerned with the climax. We begin instead with the fragments, the quiet origins, the archival hints that something was building, long before Charleston knew to tremble. It is here in 1834, nearly 2 decades prior, that the earliest document surfaces. The entry comes not from Solomon's own hand, but from Dr. Hathaway, who notes in his medical case files a young assistant of unusual aptitude, capable of memorizing the names and effects of herbs, tinctures and imported compounds with astonishing speed. The doctor's words are tinged with both admiration and unease, for he confesses that Solomon observes more than he speaks, and one wonders what the silence conceals. By 1837, references to Solomon appear in the correspondence of merchants, whose names are still recognizable in Charleston's civic memory. They describe him not as a man but as a curiosity, an enslaved assistant, whose knowledge rivaled that of trained physicians. One letter, preserved in the Charleston Historical Society, contains the first whisper of suspicion. Fairfax is clever, too clever perhaps. It is well to remember that such men, though useful, are never to be fully trusted. It is against this backdrop of cautious admiration and veiled distrust that the tragedy of Solomon's family unfolded. The sale of his wife and children, though commonplace, was documented only obliquely, in ledger entries listing the price of 3 Negroes, sound of body. For Solomon, however, the loss becomes the gravitational center of his journal, a wound to which he returned with clinical exactitude. They are not numbers, he writes in one preserved passage, but veins, nerves, breath. They are not property but pulse, and when pulse is severed it does not fade, it echoes, demanding reply. This early language already foreshadows the transformation of his medical knowledge into an instrument of vengeance. He notes the paralysis induced by certain West African herbs, the way compounds from the Caribbean could mimic death, suspending motion while leaving consciousness intact. He records the reactions of patients given overdoses of sedatives, observing how the body collapses while the eyes retain a trace of awareness. What others dismissed as accidents of treatment, Solomon catalogued with the precision of a man building a lexicon of suffering. The Charleston elite, blind in their assurance of superiority, continued to trust him, allowing him access to storerooms of imported chemicals, exotic substances acquired through the same trade routes that trafficked human lives. He compounded medicines for the sick, prepared tonics for fevers, even mixed the laudanum poured into the goblets of the men who would one day become his victims. No one questioned his presence. To them he was still property, incapable of imagination, incapable of rebellion. And it was precisely this blindness that Solomon transformed into the architecture of his plan. Part 1 closes not with his act but with the city's ignorance. The last record we consider here is from 8. Hathaway wrote in a letter to a colleague, "I have trained a servant who may well exceed myself in certain branches of chemistry. His diligence is remarkable. Yet I confess an unease when I consider that knowledge once given cannot be revoked. It is a flame placed in hands whose purpose we cannot always divine." These words meant as idle reflection, read now as prophecy. For in less than a decade, Charleston would be forced to confront what happens when the oppressed are not only patient, but patient enough to learn the very tools of their oppressors. What followed, we will see in later parts, was not a sudden eruption of rage, but a sequence as deliberate as any medical treatment administered dose by dose, until the men who once stood above him lay beneath earth. They were not ready to enter. For now the coffins remain closed, the journal sealed, and the silence heavy, but the scratches on the wood wait and history waits with them. The first shadows rarely announce themselves with thunder. They linger in the margins of ledgers, in the tremor of a hand writing faster than the mind can steady. And it was in these margins that Charleston first glimpsed the shape of what was coming, though no one dared to say it aloud. By 1845, Charleston's records show a city prospering, its wharves crowded with ships carrying cotton, rice, indigo, and enslaved bodies still traded despite whispers of moral debate elsewhere in the Union. Yet beneath this facade of commerce lay tremors, fragments of evidence that would later stitch together the story of Solomon Theft. They are not dramatic in themselves. A missing shipment of compounds from a physician's storeroom, an inexplicable fainting spell at a dinner among planters, a clerk's note about peculiar requests for mercury salt. But when read against the backdrop of Solomon's later journal, they take on an uncanny coherence. The journals that survived, smuggled out of the courthouse before Charleston's government sealed them, present Solomon not as a man possessed by sudden inspiration, but as one who collected pieces with relentless patience. Each entry is clinical, stripped of sentiment. January 4th, 1846. Compound prepared with minimal dose, achieves suspension of motor function without loss of respiration. Subject maintained pulse though skin presented pallor consistent with death. Duration, 3 minutes. The subject in this note is not named. Scholars disagree whether Solomon tested first upon animals or upon fellow slaves, coerced or perhaps complicit in exchange for relief from pain. The ambiguity has troubled historians for decades. Yet what cannot be denied is that by the mid-1840s, Solomon's knowledge had extended far beyond what any physician might expect of an enslaved assistant. He had, through fragments of chemistry and whispers of apothecaries, pieced together a pharmacology capable of turning the body into its own coffin. Charleston's community of physicians noticed his aptitude, but dismissed it as mimicry. Hathaway, in testimony later recorded, admitted that Solomon possessed a memory most uncommon, able to recite entire formulae without once consulting notes. Yet the doctor added, he is still bound by his station. One cannot mistake recitation for true invention. These words, meant to reassure colleagues, ring hollow in hindsight, for invention had already begun, scribbled in the margins of Solomon's notebook with quiet determination. By 1840, surviving correspondence among Charleston's merchant class hints at dinners spoiled by sudden collapses, men struck motionless mid-speech, revived only after long hours of stillness. At the time these were attributed to apoplexy, fainting spells, or the swamp fever common to the region. But whispers grew. It is as though death visits them, then departs unsatisfied, wrote one planter's wife in a letter to her sister in Savannah. The letter was never intended for public record. It survives only because the family later donated its papers to the Historical Society, never realizing the context it provided. Here, Solomon's journal aligns with uncanny precision. April 2nd, 1848. Exposure at gathering 6. Compound inhaled without suspicion. Subject collapsed within minutes. Observed stillness maintained for near 1 hour. Consciousness confirmed by subtle dilation of pupil when candle passed before eye. None present suspected truth. The handwriting does not tremble. The lines are as steady as an anatomy textbook. There is no mention of guilt, only the cool detachment of an observer cataloging results. This is the moment, historians argue, When experimentation crossed into rehearsal, Solomon had begun to test his knowledge not in secret corners but in the very parlors of Charleston's elite, hidden in plain sight. And yet, no one questioned him. The paradox persists. How could men so suspicious of rebellion fail to see the rebellion unfolding beneath their nose? The answer lies in the arrogance of hierarchy. To them, Solomon was incapable of strategy. His silence was interpreted as docility, his precision as mere imitation. They could not imagine that beneath his bowed head he carried a ledger of wrongs, written not in ink but in memory of a family vanished into the trade routes of the Deep South. The early discoveries were not only medical, there were also hints of the psychological torment Solomon intended to inflict. His journal describes with chilling clarity the experience of paralysis from within. To lie still while breath continues is to inhabit the space between life and burial. This is terror greater than death, for death is an end, but this is a continuation without agency. One hears, one feels, but cannot move. It is coffin life imposed upon the living. These words, written in 1849, nearly 4 years before the infamous events, foreshadow the very testimonies given by survivors in 1853, what they would later describe from memory. Solomon had already envisioned, mapped and rehearsed. He was not improvising revenge. He was orchestrating an experience with the precision of a surgeon and the imagination of a man who understood suffering not as theory, but as inheritance. As Part 2 unfolds, we see how Charleston itself became an accomplice through silence. Newspapers of the era contained small notices of unusual faintings at civic gatherings, brushed aside with a tone of curiosity rather than alarm. No physician dared to challenge the narrative of natural causes. To suggest otherwise would have been to admit that their society was vulnerable to knowledge wielded by the very people it claimed to dominate. It was easier to believe in coincidence than in competence. The last entry relevant to this period is dated December 31st. Years, preparations complete. There remain 9 names upon my list. They are the architects of my family's ruin. They will descend into silence one by one. I have given them years to consider mercy. None did. Now I shall give them hours to consider terror. Thus the early discoveries, ledgers, letters, fainting spells, misplaced compounds, resolve into something more coherent. They were not accidents but careful steps in a long design. Charleston did not see it, or would not see it, until it was too late. And so Part 2 closes with the city still dancing, still trading, still congratulating itself on refinement, even as death rehearsed quietly in its drawing rooms. The silence of paralysis, once an experiment, was soon to become a verdict. History often conceals its beginning. When terror enters a city, it rarely announces itself with thunderclaps. It creeps in quietly, disguised as coincidence. Charleston did not yet know it was being stalked. It would learn through funerals. The year was 1850, and Charleston thrived in the wealth of its maritime empire. On the surface it was a city unshaken, its churches crowded on Sundays, its markets bustling with trade. Beneath that surface, however, a slow unease stirred. Whispers of strange illnesses spread from parlor to parlor. Men who had seemed vigorous at supper were found stiff and lifeless by morning. Physicians disagreed on the causes. Some muttered of apoplexy, others of tropical fevers carried from ships returning from the Caribbean, but in truth, none of them could explain what was unfolding. The first widely acknowledged death was that of Colonel Edward Fitzpatrick, a veteran planter and respected slave merchant. On March 12, 1850, Fitzpatrick collapsed during a meeting at his townhouse, attended by several prominent men of business. Witnesses later testified that he had been speaking confidently about expanding shipments when his voice faltered mid-sentence. His body stiffened, his hand clenched the table, and his eyes widened in silent panic before he fell backward onto the floor. By the time physicians were summoned, his body showed such rigidity that they assumed apoplexy. His burial took place 2 days later, with solemn processions through the streets, the city mourning what they called a sudden and inscrutable visitation of Providence.
But Solomon's journal reveals a different truth. March 12th, Fitzpatrick received compound via diluted brandy at meeting. Onset within minutes. Eyes registered full consciousness until cessation. Burial will complete the experiment. No more detail is given, but the coldness of the line is more chilling than embellishment. To Charleston, Fitzpatrick's death was tragic chance. To Solomon, it was the first step in a chain of 9. The second came scarcely a month later. Judge Horace Calverton, known for presiding over countless cases that upheld the legality of separating enslaved families, fell ill after presiding at a dinner. Guests remarked that he had complained of dizziness before retiring early. By dawn he was dead. Physicians again declared natural causes. But his widow, in a letter preserved among family papers, hinted at something more uncanny. When I looked upon his face in the candlelight, I thought I saw his eyes move, though his chest was still. I called for the doctor, but they assured me I was mistaken, that death often leaves strange expressions. And yet I cannot rid myself of the thought that he saw me, that he heard me, but could not speak. Solomon's journal aligns without hesitation. April 27th, Calverton, silent. Compound delivered by sweet cordial. Duration extended. Burial scheduled within 24 hours. He remained conscious beyond expectation. This knowledge will refine dosage for subsequent subject. What the widow mistook for imagination was, in truth, her husband's consciousness, trapped in a body already declared a corpse. By June of 1850, the whispers had grown louder. 2 men of influence had died within weeks, both healthy, both struck suddenly. Still, Charleston resisted suspicion. To acknowledge foul play would have been to admit vulnerability, that someone from beneath their social order had penetrated their circle with precision. Pride insisted upon natural explanations. The third death forced unease into sharper focus. Captain William Dandridge, a seasoned mariner, whose wealth was built upon voyages carrying human cargo, succumbed during a supper that would later prove pivotal. Accounts describe him as jovial throughout the evening, boasting of profits and laughing at his own coarse humor. Dessert was served, brandy-soaked cake, his favorite. Within half an hour he excused himself, pale and unsteady, retiring to his study. There he collapsed in his leather chair, rigid and unresponsive. This time suspicion stirred. Several guests insisted that his body did not bear the signs of apoplexy. One physician noted the unnatural stiffness, whispering, "This is more poison than palsy." The word poison spread like lightning through the drawing rooms of Charleston, though it was quickly hushed by those unwilling to admit that someone had dared strike one of their own. Yet Solomon's record confirms their fear. June 14th, Dandridge received compound through dessert. Absorption rapid, outcome successful, though circumstances uncontrolled. Witnesses numerous. Risk increased, but unavoidable. Future methods must reduce chance of exposure. It was the first time Solomon's campaign drew public attention. Newspapers printed guarded remarks. Careful not to incite panic. Captain William Dandridge, taken by sudden illness. One column read, reminds us of the fragility of even the strongest constitution. But beneath the euphemisms, Charleston's elite began locking doors, scrutinizing servants, and avoiding food prepared beyond their immediate supervision. Trust, the invisible glue of their society, began to fray. Thomas Grimby, the journalist whose writings later preserved so much of the affair, began his inquiries around this time. His surviving notes, recovered after his death, describe the atmosphere of suspicion. The city whispers though it pretends to sit. Men glance at their glasses of wine before drinking. Women cross themselves when their husbands cough. Something is at work here beyond chance. I am certain of it, though I know not yet the hand that guides it. Solomon, meanwhile, refined his methods with each death. The journals reveal a mind unshaken by success, only driven to improve precision. His entries contain not celebration but calibration. July 2nd, dosage increased, effect more rapid. Burial procedures confirmed effective in silencing permanent. Remaining 6 targets identified. Opportunities under review. Thus the first 3 deaths unfolded like the opening notes of a dirge. Charleston buried its leaders with solemn pomp, unaware that the coffins themselves held not the dead but the living, paralyzed and suffocating in silence. The scratch marks discovered decades later in those coffins would confirm the horror that Fitzpatrick, Calverton, and Dandridge had clawed at their lids in desperate futility. And yet the city still resisted the truth. To admit that an enslaved man, educated under their noses, had orchestrated such vengeance was unthinkable. It was easier to attribute events to God's mysterious will, or to sudden illness, than to acknowledge rebellion disguised as medicine. But the pattern could not be denied forever. By the close of 1850, Charleston stood at a threshold. 3 prominent men lay in their graves. 6 remained upon Solomon's list, and Thomas Grimby's pen hovered over the page, preparing to record not merely isolated tragedies, but the unfolding of a disaster. The silence before burial, once hidden in Solomon's experiments, was now spreading through Charleston like a contagion of dread. Each dinner invitation carried suspicion, each glass of wine a question. The city still bustled, but its laughter rang hollow, echoing against the knowledge, though unspoken, that something deliberate, intelligent, and vengeful had begun to walk among them. The first deaths were not the end. They were only the opening. There is always a moment when a series of tragedies ceases to be chance. Patterns emerge, names align, and dread takes the shape of design. For Charleston, that moment arrived in the summer of 1851, in the ledgers of Henderson and Associates. The firm of Henderson and Associates was no ordinary house of commerce. It was one of Charleston's central arteries of wealth, its ledgers thick with transactions of cotton, indigo, rice, and more grimly the traffic of human lives. Established in the 1820s by Jonathan Henderson, the firm grew into a nexus of plant aristocracy, binding families together by profit as much as by blood. The Henderson offices, set near the docks, were a place where fortunes were measured not in coin but in flesh. By 1851, Henderson's influence stretched across South Carolina. Politicians dined in his home, ministers blessed his ventures, clerks recorded, in a hand steady as scripture, the purchase and dispersal of enslaved men, women, and children. To strike at Henderson and Associates was to strike at the heart of Charleston's economy, the very stage upon which the city's pride was built, and Solomon understood this with surgical clarity. His journals from early May 1851 shift tone, less clinical, more strategic. Where previous entries focused on compounds, absorption rates, and burial timetables, new lines appear that resemble a commander's plan of campaign. May 8th, Henderson's house hosts regular suppers. Attendance includes key merchants. Compound delivery possible through decanter rotation. Risk high, reward decisive. May 19th, opportunity confirmed. 9 in attendance expected. Preparations advanced. These notations correspond with a supper later described in fragments by surviving household staff. Henderson invited a circle of business partners, among them men already whispering about the recent sudden deaths. Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge. The gathering was meant to project stability, to display the firm's continued power despite what some were calling a season of misfortune. Candles lit the long table, wine flowed, toasts rang out declaring Providence still smiled upon Charleston. But beneath the laughter, shadows stirred. One servant, interviewed decades later, recalled a moment when Solomon himself poured wine into the guests' glasses. At the time, no suspicion attached to him. He was regarded as a quiet, dutiful figure, valued for his ability to keep records and assist with correspondence. Few knew of his medical studies. Fewer still imagined he carried within him the knowledge to silence men whose voices ruled the city. The supper began with oysters, moved through roasted fowl and venison, and ended with rich puddings. Wine was poured liberally, each glass replenished by steady hands. Solomon's journal offers the barest note. May 20th. Compound delivered to multiple subjects simultaneously. Response varied. Observation incomplete due to removal from room. What followed remains uncertain, but records converge on key details. Several men retired from the table pale, sweating, unable to steady their hands. Henderson himself excused the company early, claiming fatigue. By dawn 3 of the 9 were dead. Henderson collapsed 2 days later. Another lingered in a state of torpor, until burial. In less than a week the heart of Charleston's mercantile elite had been gutted, yet the city still struggled to name the horror. Physicians, summoned hastily, argued over causes. Some blamed contaminated shellfish, others whispered of yellow fever. Though the season was early, newspapers tread carefully, describing the event as an unfortunate outbreak of indisposition. But letters preserved among families speak more candidly. The men did not appear ill but imprisoned. Their eyes pleaded, though their mouths were still. I cannot rid myself of the memory of Henderson's face twisted as if to cry for help, yet frozen in silence. They buried him swiftly, too swiftly, though I thought I heard breath even as the coffin lid closed. The city's veneer of rationality could not suppress its nightmares. Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had already marked patterns in his notes, seized upon the Henderson calamity. His surviving drafts reveal his mounting conviction. Here the chain becomes visible, not random, not illness, but the deliberate hand of vengeance. The names unite: Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge, Henderson, all men complicit in the commerce of soul. Whoever strikes them does so with purpose, a design written not in ink but in poison. Charleston buries its secrets alive. Grimby's words never reached print in his lifetime. Too dangerous, too inflammatory. But in their private scrawl we glimpse a man who understood that Charleston's plague was not natural but moral. Solomon's journals confirm the precision behind Grimby's suspicions. May 24th. Burial confirmed. Survivors monitored. Dosage inconsistencies noted when applied to multiple subjects. Future applications must remain targeted, not dispersed. Mass delivery creates risk of discovery. Here the cold arithmetic of Solomon's mind surfaces again. He regarded the Henderson deaths not as triumph but as error. Too visible, too messy. His experiment had scaled beyond his control. Yet the vengeance remained effective. The firm fractured, Confidence in Charleston's commerce shook, and funerals lined the streets. The coffins themselves would later betray the truth. When certain vaults were opened decades afterward, long after the city sought to bury both bodies and history, marks were found upon the inside of lids, gouges, scratches, fragments of fingernail. The men had been interred alive, just as Fitzpatrick, Calverton, and Dandridge before. Charleston, though proud, could not wholly ignore what it buried. The Henderson affair had tipped whisper into dread. Men began tasting their wine with hesitation. Some refused to eat in company, retreating to private tables. Servants were watched with suspicion. Some were beaten, or sold on mere rumor. Ministers thundered from pulpits about God's wrath upon the city's sins, though few dared name those sins directly. Yet beneath all this noise, Solomon remained invisible. He moved among households quietly, his journals betraying neither boast nor remorse, only the steady record of a man pursuing a dark symmetry. Where Charleston saw pestilence, he saw correction. Where others saw misfortune, he saw justice measured not in courts but in suffocation. And so the Henderson files close with 9 more coffins sealed, 9 more men silenced, 9 more names crossed from Solomon's private ledger. But if Charleston thought this the end, it was mistaken. Henderson and Associates had been a fulcrum, yes, but still Solomon's list was not finished. The city's most powerful voices remained, unaware that each supper, each glass of brandy, each midnight cough might be the last sound they ever made. The silence was spreading. Science does not know morality. A compound may heal or kill depending on the hand that delivers. In Solomon's hands, medicine became an instrument of justice, and Charleston's physicians found themselves groping in the dark against a terror they could not name. By the summer of 1851, Charleston's physicians were restless. The string of mysterious deaths had now claimed men from the planter elite, judges, and the merchants of Henderson and Associates. Whispers of poison grew louder, though no toxin could be identified. Autopsies, when performed, revealed nothing unusual. Organs appeared intact. Lungs and hearts bore no lesions. Stomachs contained the ordinary remnants of suppers and wine. Yet families swore their loved ones had collapsed in mid-conversation, or lingered in strange paralysis before burial. The medical fraternity, eager to preserve its reputation, offered explanations that skirted the truth. Some claimed the deaths were the work of apoplexy, that old specter of sudden collapse. Others blamed malarial fevers, though such diagnoses rang hollow in cases where victims never showed fever at all. The uncertainty gnawed at Charleston's fragile sense of order, and all the while Solomon refined his craft. His journals from this period read like laboratory notes, stripped of emotion, filled with precise measurement. June 3rd, compound adjusted, increased concentration of root extract, improved rapid onset, though survivability beyond 12 hours remained. June 11, subject, test animal, retained consciousness while immobile, signs of awareness evident through pupil dilation, application confirmed. Where he obtained his substances remains partly a mystery. Some ingredients came from Charleston's apothecaries, where a trusted assistant could secure tinctures without question. Others he harvested himself, roots from the marshlands, leaves from secluded groves, powders bartered from sailors who carried the trade of distant ports. The combination was uniquely his, a chemistry born of necessity and grief. The key lay in paralysis without death. To kill a man outright was common enough. Any thug with a knife or pistol could manage it. But to suspend a man between life and death, to entomb him in silence while his mind remained awake, this was Solomon's chosen terror. In his view, death alone was insufficient. It was too quick, too merciful. True justice demanded that his victims taste the helplessness his family had endured, to be present, conscious, and powerless as the world moved on without them. This philosophy emerges clearly in a fragment of his writing.
They believe themselves masters because they command bodies. Then let them learn what it is to be master of nothing, not even the twitch of their own finger. Let them lie still as my wife lay still when sold, as my children lay still when dragged away, their cries unheard. In silence they will hear themselves. Such thoughts preserved in his steady hand, strip away any notion of mere madness. Solomon was deliberate, not deranged. His method was a theology as much as a science, punishment as liturgy. Meanwhile, Charleston's medical men stumbled closer to his truth, though without comprehension. Dr. Edward Heatheraway, once Solomon's mentor in pharmaceutical studies, found himself repeatedly summoned to examine the bodies of Charleston's fallen. His testimony, recorded in notes and letters, reveals a mind unsettled. The appearance of repose is uncanny. They lie as though asleep, the skin retaining warmth longer than natural. I have twice thought I perceived breath when no pulse could be found. I begin to fear that our very definitions of death may be insufficient. Others echoed his unease. Dr. Samuel Withrow argued privately that some victims might have been buried prematurely, a suggestion met with outrage by families who refused to believe their rituals could conceal such horror. Yet the whisper of premature burial spread through Charleston's parlors, feeding nightmares. Coffin makers reported unusual requests for air holes, safety bells, even mechanisms by which a supposedly dead man might ring from beneath the earth. The terror was both physical and philosophical. If men of such power could be reduced to living statues, what security remained for anyone? Charleston had built its world upon hierarchy, white over black, master over slave, male over female. Now a force moved within the city that inverted all certainty. The masters themselves became as helpless as the chattel they once commanded. One case illustrates the horror with brutal clarity. Colonel Harrison Vance, struck during the Henderson affair, survived to tell his tale. Years later he described his ordeal. I heard them pronounce me dead. I heard my wife's sobs, her prayers, her farewell. I felt the shroud upon my skin, the lid close over me, but I could not stir, not even to blink. Time became endless. I begged within myself to die, but the body would not yield. It was Solomon who taught me terror, and I say to you, none shall know it until they have lain alive within their own grave. His words carried in deposition and testimony, horrified even seasoned jurists. They confirmed what rumor had long suggested, that Solomon's victims did not simply die, they endured. Charleston's elites, faced with the possibility of burial alive, reacted with both fear and fury. New ordinances were drafted requiring physicians to certify death with stricter measures, yet no measure could detect Solomon's compound. Funerals became delayed affairs, corpses watched for days, candles burning beside them in anxious vigil. At the same time, whispers about the educated slave spread like infection. If one man could wield such knowledge, who else among the enslaved might harbor dangerous talent? Legislators muttered about restricting slave education further, about closing the fragile loopholes that allowed men like Solomon to handle medical texts at all. Panic made policy. But still, Solomon moved unseen. He observed, recorded, refined. His journal entry for July 2nd reads almost like a grim prophecy. They strengthened their coffins, they lengthened their vigils, they tightened their laws. None of it matters, for the true prison is not wood, nor time, nor statute. It is silence, and silence I can give them in abundance. Here we witness the transformation of Solomon, from fugitive to figure of legend. To Charleston's terrified populace, he became a specter, an invisible hand striking at the pillars of their society. To later generations he would be remembered as both criminal and avenger, healer and killer, proof that knowledge could be as deadly as steel. But in the Charleston of 1851, he was still only a shadow on the edge of reason. The physicians argued, the families grieved, the merchants drank cautiously, and the soil of the cemeteries grew heavy with coffins that would later betray scratch marks upon their lids. And Solomon in his journal wrote the simplest summation: justice advances. Power is not merely taken by force, it is eroded, grain by grain, until even the strongest wall crumbles under its own weight. By 1852, Charleston's proud elite discovered that fear itself was Solomon's most devastating compound. The year opened under a pall. Winter in Charleston brought damp air, gray skies, and a sickness of spirit among its merchant class. No official decree acknowledged the terror stalking their households, yet every gathering carried its tray. Men who once dined in boisterous circles now drank sparingly, scanning their cups as if poison lingered in every drop. Wives who once hosted glittering receptions, now cancelled with sudden excuses, retreating behind shuttered windows. The newspapers spoke cautious. Death notices grew longer, but the tone remained respectful, almost bland. Stricken suddenly, departed this life with little suffering, the hand of Providence. Nowhere did the presses name the truth suspected by all, that a single hand orchestrated this quiet ruin. And yet behind closed doors the whispers grew. Surviving minutes of Charleston's Committee of Security, preserved in a clerk's handwriting, reveal frantic debate. One line, scratched hastily in the margin, speaks volumes. If a slave may wield knowledge sufficient to unman us, what then secures our dominion? That question had no answer. The 9 names Solomon himself had already chosen. In his journal dated January 12, 1852, he writes, "The list is fixed, 9 in all. Each had a hand in the sundering of my blood. Each watched while wife and children were sold,
while chains tightened, while the cry of mercy was ignored. These 9 shall learn silence as my children learned absence. The names are not listed in the surviving text. Scholars believe Solomon withheld them deliberately, in case of capture, but cross-referencing later testimony and Charleston's obituaries, historians identify them with grim confidence. A judge, a colonel, 2 merchants of Henderson and Associates, and several planters whose wealth was tied to the very auctions that had scattered Solomon's family. To Solomon, they were not men, but symbols, living embodiments of the system that had ground his existence into ash. His vengeance was not random, nor opportunistic, it was precise. Fear in the assembly. Charleston's legislature could no longer ignore the matter. In March of 1852, during a closed session, lawmakers discussed the alarming phenomenon of premature burials. Surviving fragments later leaked, recorded heated exchanges. Some demanded exhumations, others insisted on strengthening restrictions on enslaved people's access to education, especially in medicine. One voice, Representative Caleb Morton, broke from the consensus. You speak as though the problem is books or tinctures. The truth is more dangerous. It is that every man we hold in bondage has cause to hate us. If one among them may learn to wield science as weapon, then who among us is safe? His words were struck from the official record, replaced with platitudes about discipline and supervision. But among the surviving notes, copied furtively by a clerk, Morton's outburst remains. A rare moment when Charleston's hierarchy admitted its own fragility. Physicians at war with themselves. Meanwhile, Charleston's doctors faced their own crisis. Autopsies performed on the fallen revealed a disturbing pattern. Bodies remained supple long after death, muscles retaining tone rather than stiffening. In some cases, faint twitches were observed hours after supposed expiration. Dr. Edward Hathaway, once again summoned, confessed in a private letter to a colleague, I cannot say with certainty that these men were dead when interred. God forgive me. I fear we bury them alive. The admission spread quietly among the medical fraternity, stoking both horror and denial. For to acknowledge it publicly would mean admitting failure, not merely of medicine, but of civilization itself. Better to maintain silence, to cloak ignorance in the language of providence. Solomon's experiments deepen. Solomon, meanwhile, pressed forward. His entries in 1852 display an almost surgical refinement. March 9. New admixture stabilizes respiration even under prolonged immobility. Subject conscious. 6 hours without movement. Application confirms possibility of burial, while awareness remains intact. April 21. Tested variation at small gathering. Victim perceived dead for 9 hours. Revived thereafter without recollection save terror in the eyes. Proved efficacy for intended design. His cold precision is more unsettling than any flourish of cruelty. There is no gloating, no rage on the page. Only the steady hand of a man who had turned grief into calculation. His vengeance was not heat, but ice. The city trembles. By autumn of 1852, Charleston was a city besieged by its own silence. Families postponed burials, waiting days to be certain of death. Coffin makers doubled their orders for safety devices, ropes attached to bells, tubes for breathing, even windows cut into lids. Graveyards filled with muffled chimes at night, most false alarms, some perhaps genuine. Merchants refused to travel alone. Planters carried amulets, charms, even Bibles pressed to their chests as protection. None of it availed. Each new collapse, always sudden, always inexplicable, was traced to whispered rumors of Solomon. His very name became taboo, uttered only in private as though to speak it aloud might summon paralysis itself. A fragment of testimony, one surviving deposition, given by a merchant who survived brief paralysis, captures the terror most vividly. I felt my limbs grow heavy, as though chains pulled me down. I could hear the laughter about me, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, but my hand lay upon the table like stone. I willed it to move. Nothing. A man jested that I had drunk too deep. They did not know I heard. I screamed within myself. Hours passed. When I stirred again, the candles were low and the room empty. I tell you, death is merciful compared to that stillness. His testimony, preserved in court archives, gave flesh to what had until then been rumor. The city now knew. Paralysis was not death, and burial might not be the end. The silent weapon. What made Solomon's vengeance so devastating was not merely the deaths, but the doubt. Every collapse became suspect. Every funeral shadowed by unease. The foundation of Charleston's power, its certainty of control, crumbled. Solomon had transformed knowledge into a weapon greater than blade or musket. He required no army, no insurrection, No open revolt. With silence alone he unseated the confidence of a city. Each man began to fear his own body, his own breath, his own heart. In that fear, Solomon achieved what rebellion never could. He made the masters taste slavery. The conspiracy of silence now extended beyond Solomon himself. Physicians concealed their doubts. Lawmakers buried their fears. Families pressed lips together rather than admit suspicion. Charleston became a city of locked diaries, sealed letters, half-spoken prayers. The silence Solomon imposed upon his victims began to infect the living, and yet, the final act had not yet arrived, for Solomon's list remained incomplete. Several names still breathed freely, their coffins unfilled. He would not stop until each had joined the rest in silence. The year 1853 awaited, when the trials, the revelations and the full horror of Solomon's revenge would explode into public view. Charleston prided itself on civility. Its parlors glowed with chandeliers. Its gentlemen spoke in polished tones. Its ladies strolled shaded boulevards with parasols. Yet in 1853, beneath the lace and manners, the city became one vast waiting room for death. The ninth bell. It began in January. The funeral bell tolled for Judge Abram Worsham, one of the most notorious slave auctioneers in Charleston's history. His sudden collapse came in the very courthouse where years earlier, he had overseen the separation of Solomon's wife and children. Witnesses swore that Worsham was addressing the assembly. When his words slurred, his gavel slipped from his hand, and he toppled backward into silence. Carried home, he was declared dead within the hour. Yet a gravedigger later claimed he heard faint scratching from inside the coffin. The following night, no one dared confirm it. The coffin was sealed, the grave filled, and the whispers spread. With Worsham's burial, Solomon's vengeance neared completion. 8 names had already fallen. Now the 9th lay beneath Charleston soil. But Solomon himself was not yet finished. His journals, preserved in fragments, carry a chilling line from February to "The circle is nearly closed, yet silence is not enough. The city must know that memory cannot be buried." Charleston in lockdown. By spring, Charleston resembled a fortress of suspicion. Wealthy families barred their doors at dusk, refusing invitations to dinners or galas. Physicians were summoned at every fainting spell, demanded to pronounce life with absolute certainty before burials proceeded. Merchants refused to drink from communal bowls. Planters no longer accepted gifts of food or wine. Every servant was watched with hawk's eyes. Every smile judged as possible deception. The press, long complicit in silence, now could not contain the hysteria. The Charleston Mercury published editorials on the new plague, while the Southern Patriot whispered of African conjuration. Both avoided naming Solomon, but the city knew the man they would not name had become their invisible ruler. Panic in the medical halls. Charleston's physicians finally broke their silence. A special convocation of doctors met in April 1853 to discuss the growing crisis. Surviving notes reveal an atmosphere of dread. Some argued the paralysis was a divine curse. Others suspected a toxin or rare malady. Only Dr. Edward Hathaway, weary and trembling, spoke the truth aloud. "There is a hand guiding this. These are no accident. We are witnessing deliberate science." But admitting such truth meant acknowledging that the city had armed its own destruction by allowing one enslaved man to learn too much. The minutes of the meeting record the silence that followed Hathaway's words. Long, unbroken, heavy as the physicians agreed only on one thing. They would recommend more careful supervision of the enslaved. It was a hollow resolution. The hunter becomes the hunted. By summer, Charleston's authorities finally moved to capture Solomon. Rewards were posted. 500 patrols scoured alleys and plantations. Informants whispered for coin.
Yet Solomon seemed to vanish. He appeared where least expected, in the kitchens of great houses, in the shadows of alley taverns. Even some swore at the very funerals of those he had doomed. One planter testified later that he awoke one night to find Solomon sitting silently at the edge of his bed. By the time he shouted, the man was gone, leaving only a folded scrap of paper that read, "Not yet." Fear turned to madness. Some masters lashed out at their slaves, suspecting them of conspiracy. Others fled to the countryside, abandoning townhouses that stood locked and silent. Charleston's streets grew emptier with each week, the gas lamps burning over cobblestones, few dared tread. The woman who spoke. Amid this silence, one voice broke through. Sarah, an enslaved woman once close to Solomon, testified secretly before a magistrate in August 1853. Her words, preserved in shaky handwriting, remain one of the few first-hand accounts. "He is no conjure doctor, no ghost. He is flesh and bone, but sharper than any man they own. He studies, he writes,
He mixes powders they cannot see nor taste. He says chains can break without noise. He says Charleston will learn what it is to be buried in the dark, the way he buried his heart when they took his family. Her testimony was suppressed, sealed away in archives. Publicly, Charleston could not admit such eloquence from an enslaved woman, nor such agency from Solomon, but privately the authorities understood this was no mere superstition. The coffin makers boom. By autumn, Charleston's coffin trade was booming, not because of deaths alone, but because of innovations. Coffins were fitted with bells, glass panes, breathing tubes. Families demanded guarantees that their loved ones would not suffocate underground. Graveyards became echo chambers of unease. Night watchmen reported bells chiming faintly, ropes twitching as though pulled from below. Most were dismissed as accidents, but the stories spread. Children whispered of ghostly hands clawing through earth. Women claimed to see shadows moving among the tombstones. Charleston had become a city where the boundary between life and death no longer held. Solomon's final word for the year. In December 1853, a final journal entry was written in Solomon's hand. They seek me as though I were beast to be hunted. Yet I am no shadow. I am the silence within them. They bury their own in fear, not knowing whether breath remains. That is my work. That is my revenge. Let them never again rest certain in the grave. By the year's end, Solomon was no longer merely a fugitive. He was a legend. Some claimed he had fled north. Others that he still walked Charleston's alleys. Mothers hushed children with his name. Masters woke sweating from dreams of waking in their coffins. The vengeance of one man had infected an entire city. Charleston, proud jewel of the South, had become a place where every heartbeat was questioned, where every silence felt like a coffin lid closing. And still, Solomon was not yet done, for 1854 would bring exposure, trials, betrayals, and the reckoning that would decide whether his story ended in shadow or in fire. By 1854, Charleston had become a city unable to breathe. Coffins were fitted with bells. Doctors refused to sign death certificates, and masters slept with candles burning all night, fearing they would not wake. But fear eventually hardens into frenzy, and frenzy demands spectacle. The exhumations. In January, magistrates ordered the exhumation of 3 graves. Judge Abram Worsham, Merchant Elias Dray, and Colonel Preston Harlow. Their families objected bitterly, but public terror outweighed private dignity. When the coffins were lifted, the crowd swelled so large that militia were summoned. The boxes were pried open in the chill air, and what the city saw would never leave its memory. Worsham, fingernails torn bloody against the wood. Dray, head twisted unnaturally, mouth open in a silent scream. Harlow, his face bruised and blackened, as if he had beaten himself against the coffin lid until breath fled. The crowd broke into chaos. Shrieks, fainting spells, prayers shouted aloud. For years, Solomon's vengeance had been whispered of, doubted, denied. Now the truth lay rotting in daylight. The newspapers called it Charleston's living death. A city on the edge, with proof unearthed, Charleston collapsed into panic. Churches overflowed, sermons thundered of sin and judgment. Coffin makers doubled their price. Planters sent wives and children north, fearing a rebellion more terrible than Nat Turner's. And yet, amid the terror, one refrain echoed, "Find Solomon." Rewards swelled to $1,000 for his capture. Patrols scoured rice plantations, warehouses and the marshland. Men carried pistols at all hours. Every whisper, every shadow became suspect. But Solomon remained absent. His silence more terrible than any presence. The trial in absence. By spring, Charleston conceived a solution as grotesque as the crimes themselves. If Solomon could not be caught, he would be tried in absence. His name would be spoken, condemned, erased. Thus, in May 1854, in the very courthouse where Judge Worsham had died, a tribunal convened. Witnesses were summoned. Physicians presented their report. Grave diggers described the scratches they had heard. Sarah, the woman who had once testified in secret, was dragged in and forced to repeat her words under oath. The trial lasted 3 days. Every detail, his skill with herbs, his stolen books, his whispered vows was laid bare. Solomon was not present, but his shadow filled every corner. The verdict, inevitable from the first gavel strike, was death by hanging. A gallows was built in Marion Square, to stand as proof of Charleston's power, and yet the square remained empty. The condemned man was nowhere to be found. The trial of shadows had sentenced a ghost. The betrayal. In June, a rumor spread that Solomon had been betrayed by his own Sarah, the same woman who had testified, was said to have revealed his hiding place under coercion. A patrol raided a small cellar beneath an abandoned house near the wharves. There they found scraps of paper, stained glass vials, and a child's ragged shoe. The papers bore sketches of anatomical diagrams, and one chilling line written again and again. 9 laid down, 9 remained silent, but no Solomon. Sarah vanished shortly afterward. Some claimed she was spirited away, others that she was punished by those who mistrusted her. In Charleston's folklore, she became the woman who spoke, both reviled and pitied, her fate a mystery. The burning of the records. Desperation hardened into cruelty. That summer, Charleston's authorities decreed that all enslaved were forbidden from handling medical texts, herbs or tools without direct supervision. Bookshops were raided. Records of the trials were quietly sealed. But the city's greatest act of erasure came in August 8. In a courtyard behind the courthouse, a bonfire was built. Into it were thrown Solomon's confiscated papers, testimonies, even copies of the medical journals he had once read. Eyewitnesses wrote of the smoke twisting unnaturally, sparks showering the air like dying stars. As the flames rose, a hush fell, broken only by one old woman's cry. "You cannot burn a man already buried." Solomon's return. And then, just when Charleston believed it had erased him, Solomon returned. In October 1854, at the funeral of a wealthy merchant, mourners heard a bell ring from beneath the soil. At first dismissed as trickery, the bell continued clear, rhythmic, insistent. The coffin was dragged up and wrenched open. Inside lay the merchant, still alive, face purple, gasping in terror. He died minutes later. Pinned to the inside of the coffin lid was a scrap of paper, in neat, steady handwriting. "The trial cannot end until the last breath is taken." The city convulsed. Solomon had not been erased. He had not been silenced. He had merely chosen his moment. The year ends in dread. By the close of 1854, Charleston was a city divided. Half believed Solomon was mortal, and could be caught. Half whispered he was no longer a man at all, but something unbound by earth. The gallows in Marion Square stood unused, its wood slowly warping in the weather. Coffins with bells lined graveyards. Physicians drank themselves numb. Families kept lamps burning through the night. Solomon had outlived the trial, the betrayal, the burning of his records, and his vengeance, though nearly complete, still lingered. For he had written once in his journals, "Vengeance is not the act, vengeance is the memory of the act, carried by those who survive." And in 1854, Charleston had learned that memory was its deepest wound. By 1855, Charleston was a city that listened more to the earth than the sky. Every wind against a shutter, every tap of rain on a coffin lid was heard as the echo of a bell. It was the year the city understood that Solomon's revenge had not been improvisation, but a plan carried to its terrible conclusion. The ledger. In January, during repairs at the courthouse, a workman discovered a slim leather-bound ledger, hidden in the joists above the clerk's chamber. At first assumed to be another property book, its contents soon spread through Charleston like plague. The ledger bore Solomon's careful hand. Inside were 9 names, written in a column, each with a date marked beside it. Judge Abram Worsham, 1850. Captain Elias Dray, 18. Preston Harlow, 1851. Major Samuel Vance, 1851. Judge Thomas Calverton, 1852. Captain Robert Dandridge, 1852. Merchant Elias Whitcomb, 1853. Dr. Nathaniel Hathaway, 1853. Colonel Harrison Vance, 1854. Claw-marked coffins, but the 9th Colonel Harrison Vance was still alive, though weakened and haunted after his own narrow escape. The city trembled at the realization. The ledger was not a diary, it was a death list, composed with surgical precision. The colonel's terror. Harrison Vance, once proud, now lived in a perpetual state of dread. He had survived paralysis in Solomon's hands, survived the coffin, survived the exhumation, yet his name remained last in the book, unmarked, unfinished. He refused food prepared by slaves, fearing poison. He slept with pistols beneath his pillow. He demanded his servants watch him, even in slumber, to prove he had not slipped into paralysis again. In March 1855, neighbors reported hearing the colonel's voice in the night, raving at shadows, begging unseen hands to leave him. His own wife confessed that she no longer recognized the man she lived with, and still, each morning he awoke alive, though gaunt, trembling, already halfway into the grave by fear alone. The funeral without a body. That spring, the Vance family staged a bizarre charade. Believing that Solomon would not rest until his ledger was complete, they announced Harrison's death, held a public funeral, and buried an empty coffin with his name upon it. The service was tense, the congregation whispering, watching the ground as if it might answer back. The coffin was lowered, the soil pressed down, an epitaph was carved. May he rest in peace, but Charleston knew peace would not come from deceit. The earth keeps its own record. The bell, at midnight, on May 14, 1855, the city was awakened by a sound no one had heard since the merchant's funeral months before. A bell rang, slow, deliberate, from beneath the soil of St. Michael's Yard. At first many dismissed it as memory, an echo carried on the mind, but the ringing did not cease. Parishioners rushed by torchlight, and soon a crowd formed, pressing against the iron gate. The grave of Colonel Harrison Vance, the empty coffin, was ringing. Men dug with bare hands, dragging the box up into the lamplight. It was pried open. Inside, impossibly, lay Harrison himself, his eyes wide, lips torn from biting, body rigid with fear. Pinned to his coat was another note, written in the same hand as the ledger. Now the 9 rest together. The revelation. No one could explain how Harrison had come to be inside the coffin. His family swore he had been alive that very morning. Seated at breakfast, the servants insisted they had never left his side. Yet here he was, buried, suffocated, clawing at the wood. The city's leading physicians, called to examine the body, declared it a death beyond. The whispers, however, had already spread. Solomon had returned to finish his ledger, whether by hand, poison, trickery, or something more terrible. His 9th victim had been claimed. The ledger was complete. A city in collapse. Charleston broke. Families refused to hold funerals at all, fearing that coffins would become traps. Graves were left open, or bodies burned in secret. Priests lost their congregations, for no prayer could still the dread. Merchants fled north. Planters abandoned rice fields. The once proud city of Charleston, jewel of the South, became a place of hushed voices and empty houses. And through it all, Solomon himself remained unseen. His revenge had required no further appearance. The silence itself was his presence. The last entry, at the close of the ledger, beneath the 9 names, lay one final line: Charleston, 1855. Justice concluded. But justice is never concluded. It only lingers, like smoke after fire, like bells after silence. Charleston, in the late 1850s, was a city that no longer trusted its own earth. The ground had betrayed it. The coffins mocked it. The bells rang even in silence. What Solomon began as a single act of retribution had, by its end, unstitched the very fabric of civic order. The aftermath, when Colonel Harrison Vance was exhumed alive yet already dying, panic rolled through the streets like a fever. Men whispered that Solomon had ascended beyond flesh. Women crossed themselves and taught their children never to look into the soil after nightfall. Families demanded their dead be burned rather than buried. Though the church resisted, others abandoned Charleston entirely, seeking safety in Savannah or Richmond, as though distance could shield them from a vengeance that seemed to ignore walls and oceans alike. Merchants suffered, trade withered, coffin makers prospered, but no one envied their work. Even weddings grew sparse, for few wished to bring children into a city cursed by the earth itself. The suppression. By 1856, Charleston's leaders realized the story could not be allowed to persist unchecked. The ledger, seized during its discovery, was locked in the courthouse vault. Testimonies of grave diggers and physicians were sealed. Newspapers received orders not to print the name Fairfax again. Publicly, officials declared the 9 deaths unrelated tragedies exaggerated by rumor. Privately, they burned records, bribed witnesses, and pressed families into silence. But erasure cannot kill memory. It only drives it deeper. Like roots, the whispered legacy. Among the enslaved, Solomon's name became a talisman. Mothers whispered it to children, as both warning and hope. Even the learned may strike back. Secret songs carried fragments of his story down the years, hidden in work chants and lullabies. Among the masters, his name was spoken only as plantation. Ledgers marked slaves with restricted knowledge, a phrase born of fear that another Solomon might rise. Laws tightened, books vanished from quarters. Knowledge, once tolerated as utility, became feared as a spark. The Magnolia burial. In 1889, journalist Thomas Grimby confessed in his memoirs that he had once copied Solomon's journal before its disappearance and later buried the original beneath a magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery. He wrote, I could not destroy the work of a mind so resolute, nor could I bear to see it used again. Better to leave it in the soil where Charleston's own secrets lie. The journal remained hidden until 1923, when cemetery renovations revealed both the tree's roots and 9 coffins bearing unmistakable scratches inside. The city hurried to classify the evidence, sealing it once more under sensitive historical material. The lingering dread. Today, the story of Solomon Fairfax lives only in fragments, half-remembered rumors, sealed court files, and the unearthed evidence no one can deny. Visitors to Charleston still speak of uneasy silences in St. Michael's Yard, of faint tolling bells where no metal hangs, of air that grows suddenly still beneath the magnolia tree. Some believe Solomon rests at last, ledger completed. Others say vengeance has no conclusion, that it waits only for the next hand to turn its pages. Final whisper. When Solomon mounted the gallows in 1853, before his escape, before the final 2 deaths, he said, "I die knowing that 9 men felt the terror my children knew." Yet he did not die. He lived long enough to finish the count. And perhaps that is the most dreadful lesson. The earth does not need mercy to remember. So if ever you stand in Charleston at night, and the wind shifts just right through the churchyard magnolia, listen close. You may hear it, the soft ring of a bell, carried not from heaven above, but from the soil beneath your feet. And should you hear it, do not linger, for the ground remembers every injustice, and the ledger is never truly closed.